This is American Government on Monday, um, August 30th. I will let you guys know when I find out. I wasn't able to be checked today, so I'll be checked tomorrow morning, and I'll let you know if we're going to have class on Wednesday or not. So let me remind you of where we are. You should be reading Wilson chapter 2 right now. You should be reading the Declaration and the preparation and review questions on the Declaration, and for Friday, the 4 additional readings, commentaries from the Nichols Reader, which, since some of you still may not have the Nichols Reader yet because of the problem with the bookstore order, I will post the readings and I will copy them and send them out just in case you haven't gotten your books yet. So let me remind you of what we talked about on Friday. The aim is to try to understand the Declaration. Our whole aim in this section on the Declaration of Independence is to understand its teachings, its context and history, which we covered on Friday, and its core teachings, which we'll be doing today and Wednesday. And then our second task, I guess that's third task. Sorry about that. Our third task is to understand the role of the Declaration and its effect on American life and how its teachings reverberate throughout our politics and history. So with respect to Friday, just to sum up briefly what I tried to suggest, we saw how the Declaration was produced by the events of the Revolution and why it was necessary. Why it was necessary, by the way, there was a range of practical and conceptual needs. One, remember the original resolution to declare independence submitted by Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, brought back from the colonial legislature at Williamsburg in Virginia. It says and it was, by the way, here, let me finish the sentence, that it would be expedient to form foreign alliances. The leaders of the revolution knew they would not be able to defeat England alone, or that the war would have been a very different quality without foreign support. And the primary foreign assistance did come from France. And if you've seen Hamilton or know something about the history, we'll talk more about this when we turn to post-Declaration founding issues. And there's a little bit of history of this in Chapter 2. We would not have defeated the British at Yorktown without French assistance. So, but there was some, remember, there was no unified Germany at that time. There were many German small states, and a good number of Hessian German soldiers and mercenaries fought for the British, but also there were some for the Americans. And after the war, by the way, they settled in the North Carolina, South Carolina region, and that's why that's why there are some interesting Southern accent idiosyncrasies in this area, like a boot. Anyway, so the reason the Declaration was necessary practically was to announce independence and to begin forming foreign alliances. It was necessary from a morale standpoint to give remember, the Revolutionary War had started already the year before on Lexington and Concord in 1775. And so with Tom Paine's Common Sense, the pamphlet that I described and that many of you know about, that was a bestseller, selling 300,000 copies in the whole continent in a few months, a new understanding of American identity as opposed to British identity so began to emerge. So so there was a kind of a necessity to the troops and to Americans to understand what exactly the war was about. It wasn't just about protesting bad crown or parliament policy. It was because we were becoming a new nation, and therefore it was the core of the identity of that nation. And then literally, as you'll see, when we start picking apart the Declaration's core teachings, the theoretical foundation of the Declaration is necessary to justify the revolution. let me be very schematic about that. Here's what I mean. As Britons, we were what core ideas were our regime when we were part of Britain? Well, one was crown sovereignty, that we are divine right of kings, which is a form of human inequality. And don't forget, Britain was a royal aristocracy, as were most of the nations of the world, not just Europe, by the way, but even the Eastern nations, China, Japan, India, were all royal aristocracies. In fact, the Aztecs, the Mayans, almost all ancient civilizations. And aristocracy and royalty are based upon the divine right to rule or a natural superiority. Aristocracy and royalty are based on doctrines of human inequality. So as you're going to see when we get to the core teachings of the Declaration, we'll see that the ideas of the Declaration were not only necessary to give Americans a distinct sense of national identity as opposed to British identity, they were necessary to explain to ourselves and to the world. Remember, the third verb in the introductory paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. We were explaining to mankind the principles of our revolution because we thought that those principles would be relevant to the rest of humanity, and they have, in fact, proved to be. Since the Doctrine of Human Rights, which was, and we'll see today, because we're going to talk about the meaning of the concept of natural rights, human rights, and I'm going to try to give you a definition of it that in some ways is formulated by me, but you'll see the concept of human rights and the declaration and the definition that I want to give really derives from the great philosophers of the 17th and 18th century. In fact, there's a particular English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, we'll come back to this in a minute, who actually formulated the core concept of the Declaration. Well, that idea began to spread through other philosophers and to trickle down into intellectual conversation in the next century and a half. But it was the United States that was the first country to practically and actually embody those ideas. Now, strictly speaking, the doctrine of human rights is a nearly universal doctrine, and we'll explore the meaning of that doctrine today. So, the other thrust of my comments on Friday were to give you a sense of the structure of the Declaration. Its first opening paragraph declaring the actions that the American people were taking, dissolving the bans, assuming sovereignty, and explaining the causes. The second paragraph, which I call the justifying principles or theoretical core, the main ideas which we're exploring today and Wednesday. And that's primarily the second paragraph. I'll read a little bit of that today, just to remind you of the language. And uh, um, then the third long paragraph section with all the different charges against the king. The fourth paragraph, which extends the responsibility for the friction between us from simply beyond the crown, the king. And remember, the conclusion of that third section is the king is a tyrant unfit to be the leader of a free people. But the fourth paragraph says, nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. And remember, that fourth paragraph says Parliament is also complicit in the injustices against the American people and the British people themselves. Again, the idea, because in that paragraph it talks about consanguinity, which is I know a big word, which I'm sure most of you were unfamiliar with before you read the Declaration. It means common kinship, common blood. Sang, sanguine, comes from the French word sang, which means blood. And so the fourth paragraph says Parliament has also screwed us over, and the British people, who should have been our kin and our protectors, failed to, and therefore that leads, of course, to the last paragraph. We therefore we need to be a separate nation, equal in our sovereignty, etc. And we'll explore that. So, aside from that overall view, the point of my comments on Friday then was to raise certain questions about the language, the critical term, and to talk about, in the authority of what does the Declaration speak? Now, it's fair to say that yes, the Declaration speaks in the name of the people, because you're going to see on Wednesday in its third great teaching, the teaching about the nature, origins, and problems of government. It does say all legitimate government comes from the consent of the people. We'll talk about the doctrine of consent. But when I say authority here, that's what I meant on Friday, and we'll come back to it. It'll become clearer today. The question is what makes the core principles of the Declaration true? What authority? And the whole point that I was trying to make in terms of the change of the language from sacred and undeniable, Jefferson's original draft, to self-evident, which is a mathematical term, a scientific term, was the drafters of the Declaration, the founders thought that the principles of the Declaration, as you're going to see from today, were objectively true. And that means the authority doesn't rest on Christianity or Judaism or any other religious tradition. It doesn't rest on religious faith. It rests on the idea that human nature and nature is constructed in such a way that you can see it, that any person of basic intelligence can see it. And so here's the taking and that's why I ended with the question of whether the Declaration, although it does mention God 4 times, is or isn't a religious document or a Christian document or whatever. Um, um, that question, and you understand why that question is so critical, because you couldn't write to mankind, which is, don't forget, mankind is still divided up by many different political and religious factions, and what one religion believes another rejects, and that kind of stuff. The Declaration thought that its principles rested upon a common, visible, and intelligible through reason and observation. Um, uh, that its statements about the world were objectively true. Now, we live in a time philosophically and culturally when we deny the existence of objective truth. Now, this is where our class is going to sound like a philosophy class, and this is a deep and profound question: whether there are in fact objectively rational principles of truth and morality rooted in our nature. It's a lifelong question, by the way. But the point here is for you, as students of American principles, to understand is why the framers thought that these principles were objectively true and available to any thinking human being, um, and what it meant for them to say that. So let me just say that by the time that I'm done leading us through these 3 great sets of theoretical principles or justifying principles, here's what. So use my definition of self-evident truth as a kind of a standard, of whether you think that applies. Then, once you see what these truths are. So as I explain what nature is, and how that operates as the foundation of standard. Although don't forget, and before we leave the question of religion and religious faith or religious authority, the first paragraph of the Declaration, phrase we'll come back to later, does say the laws of nature and nature's God. So my whole point on Friday was why I don't think the Declaration is a religious document, or it or its teachings rest on the authority of any particular general religious faith. Nevertheless, my point was it's compatible with religious belief. And let me just give a quick analogy. My guess is you all affirm that gravity exists as a natural force wedded into the natural world around us. There are many physicists, many astronomers, many biologists and chemists who are atheists, but there are also many who are religious. Just because you believe in gravity doesn't mean that you don't believe in God. Just because you think that things can be explained naturally, and that certain truths about our existence or the world around us are available to us through natural reason, doesn't mean that you can't also believe in a God who actually authorizes or brings that gravity into existence. Here's just a historical fact you may not have known. When Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, 2 times in chapter 9 and 1 time in chapter 14, Darwin himself was people think that the teaching of evolution is atheistic, but Darwin himself, in The Origin of Species, uses the mind or the intention of the creator. So even though it's true that the doctrines of evolution doesn't require a divine author of creation, Charles Darwin, thought that it was possible to reconcile evolution with belief in God. And so that's my last word on the religious character of the Declaration and its teachings. Again, I don't think they are inherently religious, but they are compatible with religious faith, as, by the way, I would hold myself as an example, and almost all Americans of religious faith since the beginning of the country would also say. So let's now turn to the subject of today and then Wednesday. There are, I think, 3 core teachings, and they build upon each other, as you're going to see. Uh, uh, 3 great theoretical foundations for the teaching of the Declaration. One is there is a doctrine of nature. So we're going to talk, our first discussion today will be, what is nature? Again, this is going to feel like a philosophy class, and in some ways an ancient language class, or an etymology, which etymology is the study of word roots. Um, Second, there's a doctrine about human beings. The Declaration rests on a theory of human nature, part of larger nature, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the Declaration does say that that human beings have a common nature underneath all cultural differences, underneath all differences of law and belief. There are human beings are human beings. That's kind of what the Declaration says. So what is it that the Declaration says about human beings? And as you're going to say, as I mentioned before, and here we'll explore this more thoroughly today, the Declaration says that human beings have rights. By nature, their nature is embedded or constructed with certain rights or claims. And as you'll see, there are two subsidiary statements about human nature that means that it means that human beings are equal and free, for reasons we'll see. And again, I'm going to give you a formal definition of a right, of a natural right, which is my own formulation. I've actually formulated this over the years teaching this subject material to try to make it clear to students, but also to myself. And you'll see it is rooted in the philosophic texts that gave rise to the core principles of the American regime. And then this third set of teachings is a teaching about the origin, nature, abuses, and correction of government. So nature, human nature, and government. We'll turn to the question of government and the issues of that on Wednesday. It would be useful, I think, to remind you of the language. Where am I getting these? In some ways, I'm getting them from the entire nature and language of the Declaration, especially going to see what we talk about nature. But I'm going to have to supply some extra material that's not in the Declaration. It's kind of a commentary, and it comes from, as I said, the philosophic sources of the Declaration. Um, but these, if you looked at the outline, if you did the outline for the Declaration, or the outline that I covered on Friday, this is primarily from the second paragraph, the justifying principles. Remember, the structure of the Declaration is that in the first paragraph they say what we're doing. The second paragraph is what we believe in, or why we're entitled to take this step of of separating and from Great Britain. The third part, the charge against the king, and the fourth part provide the evidence that we are justified in doing this in terms of how they've treated us. And remember, the fifth part, the conclusion, is a restatement of that. So this is the second paragraph of the Declaration. In the copy I sent out to you, I've italicized this. We hold these truths to be, and I said that there were 5 separate principles here, or core ideas. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, equality, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm collapsing into rights and freedom. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That the purpose of government is to render our natural rights secure. The fourth principle, that deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. So if you look on the syllabus and I say, why does government exist? What is it made of? Where does it come from? You'll see, especially from our discussion on Wednesday, that the power of government comes from the power that we give it, that we give up from our own natural power through our consent. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations upon such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect or bring about their safety and happiness. So those 5 main principles can be grouped around these 3 groups or core teachings: nature, human nature, and government. So what's nature? Let's broaden this question to an ontological or a metaphysical question. Things can exist in this universe by virtue of 3 different kinds of causes or powers. Divinity. Ever since we crawled up out of the slime and started building interstate highway systems millions of years ago, human beings have professed belief in gods or the divine or God. Whether it's the God of the Bible or the God of Western monotheism, including Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, or whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism, even Taoism, Confucianism. And by the way, if you're a C.S. Lewis fan, um, uh, Lewis has a great book called The Abolition of Man, in which he talks about the way, and he argues all human traditions ultimately pose some kind of divinity or objective standard. You might want to take a look at that book. It's called The Abolition of Man. But at any rate, what does that mean? Is that if you read the Bible in Genesis, things exist in the world because there's a unique divine power standing outside and above the world that brings them into being. And in the pagan traditions, such as Norse mythology or Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Aztec or Mayan mythology, the gods are forces of the universe that are not. They may be embedded in the forces of nature. It's a complex question, but uh, uh, the gods create the world and bring the world that we know into shape. So things can be created by divine power outside of nature. Now, of course, you have to believe in those powers in order to see their effect in the world. So, as you're going to see, there are two other forces that create things or that bring things into being, which are not divine in origin. And many people don't believe there is such a thing as a divine part of the universe or divine element of existence that stands out and above the universe. But nevertheless, the vast majority of humanity does believe in that. But let's talk about the other two ways that things can exist in the world. um, nature and art. Let's do art or technology first. The word art, by the way, means by human power and design, as does technology. And the only reason we have a different set of words like art, artificial, artistic, um, uh, um, or technology like technical, uh, tech, technology, etc., is because one is from a Latin word and one is from a Greek word. The Latin word for art or science in some parts or craft is ars, artis. Um, um, you might have seen in MGM pictures, movies, ars gratia artis, art for the sake of art. Um, anything that's artificial is made by human power and design. Again, techne is the Greek word for art or science, and that's why we have technology, as I said, technological, technical, um, um, and therefore anything that's made by technology is also so things can come into the world because human beings make them. There are no trees that I know of that actually grow tables. Uh, there are no trees that I know or fields that I know where you grow concrete. What the earth provides are raw materials um, for human making or technology. But strictly speaking, things like tables and computers and cell phones are they're not either made by God or by nature. They're made by human beings. So technology, human art, and technology can be human making can be one way that things come into being. Um, and we're going to see there's a whole realm of human life which is kind of complicated because it's both natural and and artificial. And by the way, you'd have to say in this broad sense things like culture, human culture. Remember, culture comes from the word to cultivate, from cultus, the Latin word for field, because there's a difference between wild grass growing in a field and wheat and soybeans, which have been literally cultivated by human beings. That's as this to say. Now, in other words, like bread, is bread artificial or natural? Well, again, part of it's supplied by nature, but the thing that actually makes it into bread is human making. So, but things like culture, English, Spanish, languages, governmental institutions, cultural institutions like blue jeans and ear piercing, um, and foot binding. I want to use that example later because you may or may not know what foot binding was. It was a Chinese practice up until it was eliminated by, or at least declared outlaw by the Chinese Revolution of 1911, where aristocratic women would have at birth their foot bound, um, and so that as their bodies would grow, their feet would remain stubbed and truncated. Now, you could say, why would somebody want to do that? Well, it's because that was considered an element of aristocratic female grace. So it was actually it was showing your superiority to other uh, women because your inability to walk because your feet had been stumped was actually part of the aristocratic life of women under China. And you have to see, by the way, that's you can see there's an example of where culture seems to take a natural potential, the potential for to walk and move around. And sometimes culture develops natural abilities, but sometimes culture can go against natural abilities. As we're going to see, that's a kind of an analogy for what the Declaration thinks good and bad government is. So remember, human beings do all kinds of things. They make all kinds of things. Sometimes that helps our natural potentials come into being. Um, uh, like most scientists today, and anthropologists and psychologists and neurobiologists believe, for instance, that language is a natural potential only of human beings. By the way, there's an interesting book I just read last year, Why Chimps Can't Talk. You might want to look it up. It's fascinating. And even though they supposedly can teach apes and chimps some sign language for rudimentary signs, it's true. So far as we know, there's no other species that we can observe that actually has language as we know it. And so, if that's a natural potential, then humanly constructed language actually brings that natural and potential into being, just like athletic training brings the power and potential of your muscles into being. Um, so, um, um, so let's then turn to nature. What is nature? Our word nature. Let's do the etymology or the word origins. And in the same way that there's a Greek and a Latin word, and the basic word in English has come from Latin, but there's a Greek version for nature, which also survives, as you'll see in a minute, in English. So, nature are things that born or grow in the world outside of human action and technology. So, what does that include? It includes things like plants, chickens, although not necessarily in a Purdue chicken factory, wild animals, uh, all the inhabitants of the oceans and the mountains and the earth itself are all products of nature. That is to say, of this larger force in the universe. So what is in nature, and what does nature mean? Just if you're looking at the notes, let me remind you. We're on the middle of the first page, and remember, this is the importance of what I say, and this connects what I said earlier today, earlier in this lecture. The authors of the Declaration thought that its truths were true, universally valid. That is to say, when you discover a natural truth, say about gravity, it's not just that gravity works only in Spartanburg or in America. Gravity works everywhere on Earth. In fact, gravity works throughout the universe, except in black holes. That's a whole different issue. And so these truths are universally valid and therefore not relative to a particular culture or society. Your dress, your name, your language, those are all artificial cultural. Uh, but as you're going to see, the Declaration argues your rights are not generated by government, they are not created by culture. Your rights are designed as part of your natural construction. That's what a natural right is, as you'll see. In fact, they thought that these principles, again, could be the basis of a universal standard of political right and wrong, providing a yardstick for both good and bad and illegitimate government. And we'll see that below. So let's do the etymology of nature. Nature, our word not nature, is a French word, nature, and it comes from the Latin word natura, if you're looking in the middle of the page. Now, that word natura, if you know grammar, Latin has gender and number and declination of different cases. English doesn't have so many cases. Like, for instance, who are you and whom do you see? Who and whom both are a question about identity, but one, who is a subject and whom is a direct object. Whom do you hate? Whom do you love? Um, who are you? So a case means how a word is used in a sentence. So natura is a plural word. It means it is the plural of the word natus. Now you should already be beginning to see this root coming out in other English words like natal and nativity. It turns out that the word natus is a past participle. Now, if you know English grammar, you know a past participle is like uh, whack, whacked, whacking. Whack is the verb to whack someone. I'm whacking my, I don't want to sound like a horrible human being. I'm whacking my knee as opposed to my dog, cat, or my child. Um, my child was whacked. So whacked is a past participle, meaning it receives action. Now, natus means born, because the verb in Latin to be born is nascor, not the organization that has fast moving cars. and whose building and headquarters is located in downtown Charlotte. But nascere means to be born. So if I wanted to say, and if you know Latin grammar or studied Latin, like for instance, I was born in Illinois. Natus sum in Illinois. Um, so natus, so the verb nascere means to be born. So literally, the natural world are the things that come into being not by construction, but by birth. Again, you should already start to see a complexity here about human beings in a minute. We'll come back to that. Now, our word physics comes from the Greek word for nature, physike. And so physike, which survives in physical, physics, etc., physician, comes from the Greek word physike, and that was the Greek word for nature. It corresponded exactly to the Latin word natura. Um, and that comes from the verb furen in Greek, which means to grow. So, nature is that part of the visible universe which does not owe its existence to human action or divine creation, setting that divine creation out of the universe right now. So, just in terms of the visible universe in front of us, things can exist either because they are born or come into existence or grow, like trees, mountains, oceans, um, or they can be created by human beings. Um, since humans did not create nature, after all, don't forget, if you follow the Big Bang Theory, the universe is about 13 and a half, 14 billion years old. And that's when real estate values were really high. Um, and therefore, nature precedes us, surrounds us, founds us. We might think that human technology has now made us gods, but there are all kinds of ways that we discover, either through pandemics, through hurricanes, um, that it turns out there are natural forces around us which are beyond our control. And perhaps the great question in human life today is, even with all the great gifts of technology and science and human art, there may be, in fact, limits to what we can do or make. Just in 2004, we published the human genome, the structure of DNA and chromosomes in the body. So some people think that once we have access to that natural knowledge, we can now remake human beings. Perhaps we can, but at least the idea is nature is that sum total of the things in the universe that grow or are born um, uh, outside of our power to make or create. Now, I said a minute ago, human beings are kind of complex because if I looked around the room, not my office here at home, fascinating though it is, um, um, the um, if we were sitting in class and you looked around, you'd see there were different human beings. Now, isn't it true that you were born, you came out of your mother's womb? I mean, we don't create babies in the test tube yet, even though we've come very close to it. But at least at this point, human beings originate as a natural being. But the moment they do, they slap you, they shine a light in your face, they rub silver nitrate in your eyes or whatever they do. They whack you to get you to cry and empty your lungs out. And then they put a blue thing or a pink thing, although that's becoming unconventional. And they give you a name. But your name is not a natural thing. Your name. So it turns out that who you are and what we are as human beings is both a mixture of interesting natural foundations and cultural or artificial elements. Now, of course, the task of understanding human beings and government, as we'll see in the Declaration, is what's natural and what's artificial. And again, as I said earlier, the Declaration poses that there is a natural foundation to our existences as individuals and as collective beings, and that natural foundation can be understood and grasped by human beings. All right. Because nature is objectively. And how do we know what nature is? How do we study it scientifically? We actually observe and reason, measure and reason. So remember, the self-evident part of self-evident truth is assumes that the human mind can see and grasp the natural world. We can understand natural forces. We know that why trees grow from seeds. Your mind knows that. And as you're going to see, that same power of the human mind to know and grasp the nature of natural forces, natural birth and growth, is the true, as I suggested on Friday, the true source of authority of the Declaration. Now, is there a human nature? And this will lead, as you'll see, to the second great core teaching, human nature. and this is where we'll get into the discussion of rights and equality below. Now, here's the RBP, really big point. Isn't that cute? RBP, the RBP. The Declaration holds that these truths are self-evidently, meaning visible and graspable to any minimally reasonable human mind, not destroyed by defect or corrupted by passion or prejudice, as we saw from Hamilton's definition of self-evident truth in that quote from Federalist 31 on Friday. Um, uh, that that the truths we're about to study about human beings are self-evident. That again, any minimally reasonable human being can see and grasp them and see them as true, and which can become clear to us because it's in us and around us, in the same way that that any natural law or process can be discovered by reason and observation. And again, isn't that what we call science? I mean, we may not be able to fully understand gravity at this point, but we have a pretty good grasp of the structure of the atom, the standard model of quanta and subatomic particles. And again, extending all, like if you get a house plant and you put it in the sunlight and water it, you'll understand enough about natural processes to know it'll grow. And if you, on the other hand, cover it with cement and that the plant will die, nature won't take place. So the presumption is that natural forces, at least to a critical extent, can be understood and grasped by human beings through observing and reasoning. So now let's talk about let's turn to the second grade, human nature. And here's where we come to the core doctrine of human equality and rights. The Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident. What truths? That all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I have to say that the doctrine of human equality has been controversial from the very beginning. And as you're going to see when we turn to slavery and the American founding and in the Constitution, it's clear, obviously, that slave owners didn't simply accept the doctrine of human equality. And when we read some of the commentaries on the Declaration, including, by the way, Chief Justice Taney's opinion in the infamous discussion of Dred Scott v. Sandford, which we'll talk about on Friday, not everyone thinks that human beings really are equal. What does it mean to say that a human being is equal? And take, for instance, I'm wearing glasses. I didn't always wear glasses. 52% of the American population wears glasses, which means that with respect to the natural power of eyesight, human beings are not equal. And it's obvious that not all human beings are equally intelligent. Not all human beings are equally smart. Some are remarkably beautiful and intelligent. But it's clear that natural abilities and tendencies are not equally distributed. So is it true to say that all human beings are created equal? What does that mean? Now, as you're going to see, two ways to attack this question before we get into the definition of rights. What might it mean to say that human beings are equal? One is, which will only propound the complexity to some degree more, is when you're interpreting a term in a document, like when the Declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So what does it mean to say human beings are equal? Well, one way when you're interpreting a document, a term in a document, is to see how that term is used in other parts of the document, if it is used. And if you've read the Declaration with care and followed my lecture on Friday, you know that the word equal and equality is used somewhere else in the Declaration. It's used in the first paragraph. Of the three verbs in the first paragraph, dissolve, political bonds, separate, dissolve, assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal status to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. So remember, what are the powers of the earth that are referred to in that part of the Declaration? They are the nations of the world, the countries of the world. Now, there, it evens to be even crazier. I mean, if you look at the 200 or so nations that exist in the world today, you have the United States of America. You have really big places like Canada and America and Russia and China. Huge countries, India, nearly entire continents. And then you have countries like Monaco, which is like 4 miles wide, Liechtenstein, which is 8 miles wide. You have mighty superpowers like the United States that have about 4,000 nuclear weapons that can incinerate every member of the human race 50 times over, versus I don't know what um, um, Kazakhstan. Most of us aren't afraid of Kazakhstan. Maybe we should be afraid of the United States because we put all these weapons into the little black uh, briefcase that Secret Service agent always carries around close to the president. So when you're voting for president, remember you're voting for somebody that has his finger on the button to destroy humanity. Um, um, but at any rate, isn't it crazy to say the nations of the world are equal? They're not equal in size, geography, territory, power, wealth, and yet the Declaration calls the nations of the world equal. In what sense are the nations of the world equal? They may not be equal in their power, or in their size, or in their geography, or in their population, or in their wealth, but they are all equal in their independence. Remember, that phrase in the Declaration says the separate and equal um, uh, 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 and independent station. Whatever a nation is, whether it's small, tiny, weak, strong, extensive, or whatever, it is independent. It is sovereign. Now, the word sovereign comes from the French word, it's a French word souverain, that comes from the Latin word eventually super, which means above, and reign, like the reign of a king. It turns out the word reign, which is the French version, comes from the Latin word rex, which means king or ruler. So sovereign, what sovereignty is, and this is what it means for the U.S. to assume sovereignty in the second paragraph of the Declaration, the second sentence of the first paragraph of the Declaration, and um, uh, the last paragraph of the Declaration, which describes things like the power to declare war and peace, conclude treaties, and run their own domestic institutions. All sovereign nations possess that. So sovereign means there is no higher power than that. Now you might say, I'm sorry, I don't think the power of the United States is the highest power in my life. You may believe in God, you may belong to a church, but strictly speaking, it's true that that's why politics is so important, because it turns out that sovereign nations, unless they're defeated or destroyed by another nation and taken over in war or something, as long as you exist as a sovereign nation, you control everything about yourself. That's, of course, that you can within your power. So we will see that when we turn to the doctrine of human equality, that when the Declaration says human beings are created equal, we'll see that there's an analogy that the Declaration always has already drawn. So here it is again. In the same way that the nations of the world, although they may be unequal in many other respects, in their essential aspect of independence and sovereignty, they are equal to each other. As you will see, that's very close to what the Declaration says about human beings. And now let's turn to that. But before we turn to the Doctrine of Rights, let's explore what the Declaration means by equality. If we look at another way, if we look at a natural inequality that you are all quite familiar with between parents and children. Now, you are all 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, and my guess is you are probably ready to say to your parents, thanks for the diapers and feeding us and giving us our first cell phone at the age of 5. Thanks for all you've done, but I'm on my own now. My guess is each one of you at this point in your life, as young adults, you are feeling the need to escape from or liberate yourself from your parents' authority. In fact, if I asked every one of you, do you feel your parents have the right to determine all aspects of your life right now? Now, some of you might say, well, my credit card is still paid for by my parents. And my guess is, even though you are still dependent in some ways on your parents, you still think that when it comes to like what you're going to wear in the morning, or whom you're going to date, or what time you go to bed at night, that you're ready to make those decisions for yourself. Would you all agree? In other words, in some ways, don't you think you are equal in authority over your own life? Not fully, because again, you don't pay for your own credit cards unless you're working and independent. But when you were 5 years old or 2 years old, were you equal in sovereignty or independence over your own lives? No, you were ruled by your parents. Why? Why is it right that your parents rule you like absolute dictators, even if, God willing, non-abusive and kind dictators, when you're 5, but not when you're 20? What has happened? What has happened is that nature has given you a certain range of potentials as a human being, and that it turns out that at the age of 2, 3, 4, 5, um, those potentials, and especially your mind, your reason, the quality by which you see what's good for yourself, your natural ability to see and understand and act on your own good, which is essentially reason at work in the human being. It turns out that when you're 5, that's just not as well developed as it is when you're 20. And what happens is that there is a genuine inequality there between your parents and you at the age of 5. But what happens is that, God willing, people grow up. And that means the difference in ability, your natural reason and ability to see and understand your own good, even you would admit that at the age of 5, you shouldn't have independence and sovereignty as a human being. You need your parents' rule because that's how natural infants are, of all species, by the way, are constructed. So, in a way, what the Declaration seems to say, all people are created equal, all men are created equal, all people, is that every person who has reached natural adulthood is equal in their ability to rule themselves as anyone else. Now, there are many other customs and traditions in the world where parents control their children's decisions really well into their adulthood. In India, for instance, which I visited for 7 weeks in 1990, the extended family where people get married and don't move out on their own, but move into their parents' house and become part of. And so actually each family sometimes has a household, has 30, 40, 50, 60 members, and where parents and grandparents continue to rule over their children, even adult children. Americans would have none of that. We believe that when you're ready to rule yourself, out you go, unless, by the way, you're living in your parents' basement. In which case, by the way, if you're living in your parents' basement, or when you go home to visit in Thanksgiving break or fall break, or even now, if you're living at home, you often come in conflict with your parents about how to run your life. But my point, I don't want you to lose my main point here. You more or less feel entitled to run your own life because now you have grown up, quote unquote. That's a natural process. And so, on one level, when the Declaration says human beings are equal, it doesn't mean every human being is equally smart or beautiful or fast or strong. But it does mean that every adult human being who hasn't been damaged by nature, by an accident or some kind of handicap or some form of retardation or something like that, which is a politically incorrect word. But I mean, um, every adult human being is equal in their ability to rule themselves. And I think if you see it in that term, the Declaration's doctrine of equality, and we'll be exploring this more on Wednesday and Friday, as you'll see, is pretty commonsensical. It seems self-evidently true that when you're an adult, you should run your own life. Now, what about government? We'll come back to that on Wednesday. Now, so what's a right? Because that's the next statement in the Declaration. We hold these rights, that we are bound by certain inalienable, inseparable. They're in our nature, part of our natural construction rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is my formulation. Now, as I said before, the concept of right actually comes from the great work of political philosophy written by Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, in 1651. It is he who constructed the concept of natural rights, and then taken up by John Locke and other Baruch Spinoza and David Hume and Adam Smith, and that became the concept that is part of common sense, and then the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to give a formal definition for a right. And by the time that you grasp this definition, if I've laid this out properly, you will see how these truths are self-evident truths. Turn to the middle of page 2, and here's my formal definition of a right. The equal natural freedom to use our roughly equal natural powers to obtain our equal natural needs or passions. As I say in the comment, this is Povordian. Say that 10 times fast. But it's based upon Hobbes, Locke, and Jefferson. Now, note about this. There are 3 sets of 2 adjectives: equal and natural, equal and natural, equal and natural. There are 3 nouns, substantives, in the definition. Now let's do this bass backwards and start with the last one: natural needs and passions, natural powers, and natural freedom. I see I'm just about out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to postpone this full definite discussion of the definition of a right, and we'll finish this material on Wednesday. So when I pass the notes out for Wednesday, I'll duplicate this part of the notes. So we didn't quite finish with today's notes, but I'll take this up on Wednesday.